The largest chain food supplier in the world is McDonald's. 1% of the population of the world will eat at McDonald's today. In the United States, about 10% of our society will have at least one meal from McDonald's today. The Golden Arches are now a more recognized international symbol than the Christian cross. There are more than 30,000 locations worldwide, and the one that is near Buckingham Palace is actually owned by the Queen of England. They currently sell 75 hamburgers a second, every second of every day. The consistent taste of McDonald's food has become so familiar to so many people that, along with the fact that they have become the largest toy distributor in the world, you find that people simply defer to going there. Even when we serve lunch at Harmony House. At Harmony House, the domestic abuse shelter can house up to 150 people, and a lot of times they're full. But when we serve lunch, we are typically serving 30 to 50 people. Well, where are the rest of them? Well, some of them are at work, but a whole lot of the families walk their kids 1 block away to McDonald's and buy lunch for them at McDonald's. We are giving them a home-cooked, healthy meal for free, but they will go and eat at McDonald's out of sheer habit and compulsion. With millions of people eating there every day, and with people even declining healthy, free food to go eat at McDonald's, you might think, this must be really good food. Or this might be really healthy food. This could be really good for me. But the truth is, it isn't either one of those things. And it isn't even inexpensive, especially when you compare it with the fact that we are trying to give them free food. McDonald's has huge numbers, even though their product is overpriced. It is the legal equivalent of poison, and a lot of it only vaguely tastes like what it says it is. I mean, do you ever taste the chicken in a chicken McNugget? I mean, I'm not sure what that is, but it doesn't seem to involve a lot of chicken. But if people voting with their feet was a clue as to what is great food, you would have to give the prize to McDonald's. But we know by lots of different factors that it not only isn't the best food, but sometimes it's the worst. And it is contributing to childhood obesity the world over, and it is causing diabetes in countries that had never had diabetes before. McDonald's is proof that you can serve what may be among the worst of food products available, but still win in the economic numbers contest simply through successful marketing. I have good friends who used to be active in our congregation before they moved to Florida, but when they lived here in town, oftentimes Ron and June would invite me to go with them down to the buffet at the chateau on the lake for Mother's Day or Easter or something. And our route of travel took us past this large campus on South 65 of what I like to refer to as Six Flags Over Jesus, our true megachurch. And we would pass as their thousands of members were being guided out by off-duty policemen in vests. You know, they had huge traffic snarl when their church ends. And Ron would look at me and say, "Why don't you draw crowds like that?" He was my friend, so he still has all of his teeth, but it's not an illegitimate question. Why do we have just a few dozen people here on Sunday mornings? And when I travel to speak, whether I'm speaking in Ohio or Texas or California or South Carolina or any of the communities where I spoke in England recently, at St. Albans, at Malvern, at Hove, at Brighton, why is it always just a few dozen people when progressive thinkers gather to talk with each other? And I don't want to fall prey to sour grapes interpretations of these numbers. In the ministry, some of you pastors will remember, we had what we called steeple envy, that someone who had a bigger church and probably then a bigger salary and more people listening to them, more ego additions, that there is a way of just taking sour grapes that, oh, they've got bigger numbers for all the wrong reasons. And I don't want to fall prey to that. But I don't have any aspirations to have a warehouse-sized church building with a Starbucks in the lobby. It would be affirming if we had 200 or 300 people here on Sundays. We'd figure out how that worked. It would even be affirming, I don't mind being perfectly honest with you, if my book sales would reach somebody's bestseller list even for a week. I mean, that would feel nice to be more mainstream in some ways. But we are destined to be in the rank minority because we have set out to be thought innovators, thought leaders. We are prophets in the sense that we have accepted the challenge of speaking truth to power. Now, innovation always has a bell curve. It is a very small minority at the beginning that will address an ethical issue. And you have to build an audience of people who agree and are willing to get involved and willing to do the work to get it going until it becomes a majority view. Just as an example, when electricity began to be harnessed for use in the home, people would literally build an electric generating plant and sell service to the people that could afford to have a line strung to their home to run usually a few electric lights and a refrigerator. The origin of electricity on the consumer level in America was electric lights and electric refrigeration. But it was not a utility that was being sent to poor neighborhoods. It wasn't available to most people, but there was a preacher named Washington Gladden, who history calls a preacher of the social gospel movement, who insisted that the safety and labor-saving nature of electricity should be available to everyone. And he built a movement that got the electric utility extended to all neighborhoods. Well, it didn't have to work out that way, but you can point at any number of issues in which progressives will offer an innovative idea for society, that slavery is wrong, that child labor is wrong, that we ought to integrate the schools, that public schools should be free and available to everyone, or higher education should be tuition free. You begin with an idea, and the majority of people will initially react to that idea as being unwelcome or crazy. And sometimes they will even violently oppose the implementation of a new idea. But it's always a minority of innovators that are constantly trying to get the idea out there to get other activists involved. The crest of the bell curve, if you went into some detail about that, is on the other side of it is when criticisms began, and there's detectives that are trying to say, well, he's doing this for the wrong reasons, or, and we see ourselves going through this. We're in a downward slope now. You think we are fighting ethical issues now that we thought were over, that availability of birth control or legal abortion. We thought those battles were 1970s and 1980s battles, and we're having to fight them again because we're on a downward slope of that bell curve of ethics, but we always hope that it's going to come back up. You take a look at this gospel lesson we had today from the 3rd chapter of Mark, and it tells us one of those stories about the tension between Jesus and the prevailing culture, or between Jesus and the religious majority. And it's a standout story that was a favorite of mine during all the years that I've worked for a traditional denominational church, because I never had a board meeting. In all the years I was in a big church, I never had a board meeting that there wasn't a second meeting in the parking lot afterwards of just the people that went out to figure out, how can we screw him up best? What can we do to undermine everything that we just decided in the actual board meeting? Mark writes this story in a way where it's Jesus constantly being watched by his critics, looking for a flaw in the fabric, some Achilles heel that they could exploit to undermine him. So he's presented with a disabled man on a Sabbath in a synagogue meeting where his critics were waiting to see if he would do something wrong. Well, he's going to what you learn in ministry is you're going to get criticized either way. Either you don't have enough compassion to deal with the man's disability, or you deal with it on a Sabbath when you're not supposed to work. Either way, he's going to get in trouble. But Jesus asks the rhetorical question in this story: were Sabbath rules intended to help people or to hurt people? All these regulations we've got, are they for us? Is the Sabbath so we can rest? Or is it so you can condemn me if I do something good on the Sabbath? And of course, there's no answer to the question. And in this narrative, he can heal people. I wish that part was true, but he does. He heals a guy, and it says immediately. And Mark uses the word immediately, where the other gospel writers edit that word out. I can't remember what the word is in Greek. Can you remember what it was? It's not important. We'll talk about it over lunch. But Mark uses that word a lot to imply that the whole thing is like a rush, but immediately after doing a very good thing, they go out to decide how they can kill him. That's their reaction to the good thing. It's often true that no good deed goes unpunished. But if you are an innovator, if you're trying to be at the beginning part of that bell curve, you're trying to do the right thing, the whole world will tell you not to care, not to get involved, to mind your own business. I was 22 when I entered the ministry, and the first thing I encountered in my first ministry setting in rural Kentucky was a dry county where there was an active bootlegging operation that sold not just alcohol and beer in the black neighborhood in town. And they were selling drugs and alcohol to underage kids, and I saw it all around my church community. So I went to see the prosecuting attorney to find out why they were not closing the bootlegging operations in town. And he said, well, that's a black problem, isn't it? Why do you care? And can you imagine the presumption that a minister of a white congregation wouldn't care about the ethics in a black community? It was also true, we found out later, that those bootlegging operations were giving kickback to the prosecuting attorney. That is another story that I will publish one day. The only proverb that I've ever created in my 40 years of ministry is one that I came up with after that first ministry setting. My proverb says, if you light a candle in a dark place, you will draw bugs. No matter what good thing you try to do, the first thing that will happen is that you will draw critics who will show up to tell you that you did it the wrong way. You did it at the wrong time. You did it for the wrong reasons. You did it for, in this case, the wrong people. And because of that, most people will give up very quickly. They just, they will just decide that, I've got my own opinions. I'll keep them to myself because I want to be acceptable to the majority. I don't want to become a target of that kind of criticism. So in order to stay relatively popular or acceptable, you just never do anything that rocks the ethical boat of society. That's why I love this 2,000-year-old quote from the Roman Caesar, Marcus Aurelius, that the object of life is not to find yourself on the side of the majority, just to avoid being found in the ranks of the insane. And I think the implication is that the majority is often quite insane. When you realize that the first minister that suggested that we really shouldn't have children working in these textile industries, and people were like, why are you concerned about that? That's only happening to poor families. Why would you be worried about that? Now, you all have heard me tell this story before, but let me repeat it in case our internet audience hasn't caught it all. In the church I grew up in rural Kentucky, there were elders in that church that owned a sewing factory, and they made the life of the women that worked there, they paid them piecework, and they had concrete floors. The sewing machines were bolted to the concrete floors where we had to stand up to sew, and the restrooms never had toilet paper or soap or hand towels, and the break area, they allowed mice and rats to live there because they wanted the women to sew. Just sew. They don't want you to have a good time. It wasn't air conditioned. You didn't want to take a long lunch break. You didn't want to go to the restroom very often. You just wanted to sew. The pay was small. The conditions were horrible. And our minister went to see these church members that owned this sewing plant to confront them about the wages and the working conditions. And they said to him, "You stick to preaching and we'll stick to business." Well, he did stick to preaching, except that he called a labor union organizer to come and organize a union in this sewing factory. And the elders responded by firing him. And he responded by dying of a heart attack. And I've often thought that he was a martyr of the 1960s church, that he literally gave his life working for the poor, but he was not minding his own business. But folks, if we had waited for a popular vote to end slavery, to end child labor, to end racial segregation, to obtain gay rights, we would still be living under a puritanical rule. Ethics is not determined by majority vote. Majority opinion has nothing to do with right and wrong. I would love for our church to have bigger numbers. I would love for our advocacy for social justice to be a lot more popular. But on matters where the majority gets it right, I don't have to talk about those things very often. If we're getting it right, we don't have to stand up and applaud all the time. The only reason to preach about something is if you're trying to address an issue that deserves some change, right? I had a regular column in the newspaper for 25 years, and I was regularly called in by either the publisher or the editor for a little come to Jesus meeting. They were never disagreeing with the facts of my columns, but they were terribly upset by how offensive they often were and by the unpopularity of the topics that I addressed. Now, this saying is not original to me, but what I said to repeated editors, because they moved those guys out pretty fast, was journalism happens when you write something that someone doesn't want you to write. Everything else is just advertising. Now, I understand there's got to be a certain amount of fluff in any print media. You got to run some sports scores, you got to run some recipes. There's sometimes just hard data reporting, the weather, whatever. But journalism happens when you write something that someone doesn't want you to write. When you look at newspapers today, where is the journalism? Where's the moral challenge? When do they speak truth to power? Where do you find investigative reporting or any kind of innovation? Where's the courage? When I am working in Nicaragua with the Rainbow Network, we have all these high school sponsors, and we always gather the high school students when the North Americans are there, and we ask them, well, what do you want to do? And we always hear computer science and medicine. They both, I think they think North Americans like that answer. But the answer that thrills me is when someone says journalist, that they want to be a journalist. Because in Nicaragua, being a journalist is kind of like being a journalist in Russia. It's a good way to get killed. And all these kids know a journalist that has been killed. They all have known of someone in La Prensa that has been killed for what they write. So at least in Nicaragua, when a student tells me that they want to be a journalist, that's the student that I want to sponsor, because that thrills me that they've got the courage to want to speak truth to power. I have to keep reminding my Christian pastor friends that Jesus wasn't killed for being a moderate who avoided offending people. No innovation, no progress ever takes place without someone being willing to make nearly everyone uncomfortable. And is it any wonder then that we virtually never associate big steeple churches with having any influence on the morality of society? They are self-congratulatory groups that offer almost nothing to the progress of society. There's a very helpful saying about this. It's been attributed to Gandhi. It wasn't from Gandhi, probably originated in early 20th century labor union organizers, but the saying is this: first they ignore us, then they make fun of us, then they fight us, and then we win. And that's really kind of that progression of the bell curve that we talked about, is that initially people will ignore you. You know, you think about Bernie Sanders' campaign, people kept saying that he was crazy. Well, he was crazy, but he was saying what has been implemented in policy in most of Western Europe. So are you saying all of France and England and Denmark, are they all just crazy? No, they're not crazy. It was just a way of being dismissive at first. So at first they ignore us, then they make fun of us, then they fight you. And when they fight you, they don't always fight fair. But if your cause is right, you have to believe that even though the arc of the moral universe is long, that it bends towards justice, that you will eventually win if your cause is right. Now, genuine innovation always starts with a tiny minority that is willing to face social isolation, ridicule, oppression. But if you know you're right, you don't give up, because you recognize that it's only that minority that's ever going to make the change. Maybe it's quoted too often, but Margaret Mead had this very encouraging proverb that deserves to be repeated. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Reasonable people conform to the majority. Unreasonable people don't conform. And that is why every bit of progress we have ever made as a society started with an unreasonable person, which is most of you, right? I can tell you this: trying to live heroically doesn't make most people see you as a hero. If you want to be popular, if you want people to like you, if you have some hope of becoming famous, then you have to set your sights on the top of that bell curve and not on the humble beginning where real prophetic and innovative thinking begins. And if the gospel stories about Jesus are a good teaching tool, when you really knock yourself out to help someone, if you try to assist in some cause, then for reasons of jealousy or resentment or competition or just plain meanness, there will be those who will respond by immediately plotting to bring about your demise. Even on the personal level, I have known for 35 years that the fastest way to lose a church member is to agree to loan them money to get them caught up on their rent or their utility bills, or even to agree to provide them long-term counseling. People are more likely to disappear than to simply be polite about having accepted some help. But if we are sincere spiritual people, we don't do good things in order for people to feel indebted to us, to use such generosity in exchange for loyalty or popularity. We do what we do because of who we are, not because of how they're going to react. And if we're certain about who we are, then it doesn't really matter whether our sincere efforts are ever rewarded or recognized or applauded. You do the right thing because it's right, and then you let the chips fall where they will. I don't know who originally said it, except that I know that it was attributed to Mother Teresa, and it wasn't her. But no matter how many people try to give it to her, I think this is wisdom that stands on its own 2 feet. It says, people are unreasonable, irrational, and self-centered. Forgive them anyway. If you are kind, many people will accuse you of selfish or ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. If you are successful, you will win some unfaithful friends and some genuine enemies. Succeed anyway. If you're honest and sincere, people may take advantage of you. Be honest and sincere anyway. What you spend years in creating, others can destroy overnight. Create anyway. If you find sincerity and happiness, many will be jealous. Be happy anyway. The good you do today will often be forgotten. Do good anyway. Give the best you have, and it will never be enough. Give your best anyway. In the final analysis, it's between you and God. It was never between you and them anyway. My friends, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You will most likely never be recognized or treated kindly for the good that you do, but regardless of the plotting and scheming of the majority, you go get busy changing the world for the better. There will be bugs, but you have more important things to worry about than bugs. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.